Welcome to the 2-Month Review, the weekly podcast brought to you by Open Letter and 3%, in which we take a giant book, break it down bit by bit, section by section, talk about it, analyze it, have some fun, and do our best to make sense out of whatever it is that we're reading. So this season, which is the 19th, is all about The Remembered Part by Rodrigo Frazan, the third book in the trilogy, the part trilogy, or whatever you want to call it. Triptych is what they're referring to it as in this Latin American Literature Today articles, which we'll be talking about. But whatever it is, we're finishing up today the first part, so up through page 354 in this giant honking volume. I am Chad Post from Open Letter Books, and I'm joined this week by Kaya Stromanis from Open Letter Books and translator from Latvian. How are you doing, Kaya?
I am okay.
You look like you have a huge background. For anyone watching, like the background looks gigantic. Like there's a lot of negative space surrounding you.
A lot of negative space. Yeah, that is the introvert's dream, is it not?
Don't even get me started about this introvert crap. Yeah. So you you have not read this section, which is fine. I asked you to come on because we're having like some scheduling difficulties with Brian, who would love to be here and is a big fan of the book and loves reading it so far, but can't at this moment. But we wanted to at least record this podcast, even if it's a bit shorter and a little bit less in depth than some of the others, so that we can move on with the book and get into parts 2, 3, and finish what is referred to in the book as the Impossible story, basically the Impossible trilogy. And I don't want to keep pushing it down the road to actually finish it. So we're here. We're going to do our best. I'll talk a little bit about the book, but more importantly, it was just announced yesterday, or just released yesterday, that Latin American Literature Today's 26th issue has Frazan as like its cornerstone, as its like featured author. There are I had this open just a second ago, but I think there are 6 articles about his work. One that's called Rodrigo Frazan, Literature's Master of Ceremonies, Introduction to an Impossible Dossier. One that's From History to Stories, From Nation to Fiction. Then Rodrigo Frazan and the Novel of the Year 2000, which is about mantra, I assume, because that was what he was commissioned to write for the Random House Mondadori in Spain. They had a project of having, I think it was 6 different authors write about different cities, world capitals, world cities for the year 2000. And that included Roberto Bolaño book, the one about the boxer in Italy. I can't think of the name of it right now. But then also mantra. There's also 7 notes on La Velocidad de las Cosas and the expansion of the universe. And then finally, the one that I think we'll mostly talk about, Translator's Triptych, Around the World, All Worlds, in One Sentence by Rodrigo Frazan. Overall, it's amazing that LALT did feature him in these ways, and I hope that it brings a lot more people to his work. And it is cool that everyone basically starts with, his books are crazy. they're hard to understand and to read and to like deal with, and that's awesome.
Well, I mean, except for, so you also kind of partially assigned this article about the triptych to read for today's recording for today's podcast, and I misunderstood and just clicked on the first one, which does talk about it does talk about triptych effects and trios of things. So I thought I was on the right track. But I did sort of just glance through the translation one. So maybe we can talk about both, because what you just said about everyone starting off by saying Rodrigo's hard to read, that's definitely not the vibe in the article, the main article titled the Frazan Literature's Master of Ceremonies.
Oh, okay. So what's that one about?
The vibe with that is really about, it's kind of a dossier on his literary career, on all of his writings. And what I liked is there were some things that we sort of talked about, you and I talked about when I came on, several weeks ago. We were talking about all the referential things. I mean, that's something that you can't not talk about referencing when you talk about Frazan, and because everything is a reference to another thing, to another thing, to another thing. Even the epigraphs, you have to read all of them because all of those are very intentionally chosen. And, I remember, I think with the first book when we were laying out, I'm getting a little off topic, but, we even thought about breaking up or setting the epigraphs, just worrying about the spacing of them. And then Will Vanderheiden, the translator into English of Frazan's books, coming back and saying it's a very specific way that they've been chosen, or like you can't move them around to fit them onto papers in different way. Like it's very intentional how Rodrigo has ordered these.
I don't remember that at all.
Oh, really? Okay, maybe it's just me, or it might just be me. But one of the things in the very beginning of the Wrong article that I read is that he writes, Frazan's writing seems to open its doors to everyone and everything. Songs, films, personal anecdotes, stories of writers' lives, the reading and rewriting of his own books and the books of others, et cetera, et cetera. And that's something where I think it's such an interesting. I mean, the books are difficult to read, but at the same time, they're so accessible. They're so approachable, or maybe it's the other way around, that the book itself makes the reader approachable. And then he also says, like, the novels and stories of Rodrigo Frazan stroll through genres, short stories that are almost novels, novels with short story hearts, mutate into science fiction, into pop, hagiography, into Bildungsroman, into songbook, into monumental triptych, like a kaleidoscope that always also toys with language, pulling in neologisms, symbols, typographies, and an abundance of parentheses and footnotes. It shouldn't. I don't know. I don't like the idea that it's a hard book to read, because there's so much of the quotidian in it, and of such a shared experience. It's very international. It's very, yeah. I'm just a little shocked that I mean, I don't disagree that it's hard to read these books, because you do need a lot of mental power to keep track and to stay on topic, which is something that I can't do in my daily life anyway. But still, at the end of it, it all makes sense and it's all cohesive.
Yeah, I don't know that, like, the difficulty when we talk about the translation, translating difficulties are different and specific. But when we were talking last week about it, it is the sheer voluminous nature of it is one that gets mentioned. That, like, this trilogy combined is over 2,000 pages. It's like it is a lot to, like, to just digest, and that it doesn't necessarily give you the plot bit by bit by bit in a way that, like, oh, I can't wait to what happens next, because it's telling and retelling the same thing over and over again. And this book, we'll come to this in a second, but Will Vanderheiden mentions in his section of the article that I read on, which was 3 translators, one from French, one into French, one into English, and one into Italian, each selecting one sentence and illustrating, like, how that sentence both embodies, like, his overall program and nature of writing, but also, like, is difficult to translate for various reasons and how they approached it and so on and so forth. But most of all 3 of them, I mean, I don't think this is offensive, but all 3 of them are sort of like hand-wringy on, like, I can't just pick one sentence and what could it be and everything, blah, 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 blah,
yeah.
blah.
Well, you are right. You are right in that I think it's the Italian translator ends up saying that they're going to put off choosing a single sentence.
Yeah.
But it's a very long explanation.
Very long. That's so. I mean, not to poke fun at stereotypes, but that's so Italian to just not do a thing and just manana.
I thought you were going to say that's so translator. Like, yeah, also, yeah.
I mean, Jesus, you people are exasperating. But, like, you don't finish anything. Nothing's ever on time. It's always so hard. Wrote every word. No, I'm just kidding. But, like, it is pretty Italian to just be like, well, I'm just not going to do it. Like, it's like paying taxes in Italy. You just don't do it. Like, it's fine. You just don't bother. That's why your country's all screwed. The thing
wow.
I haven't pissed off Italy. I pissed off Ohio frequently and other countries, but Italy's a new one. I
That was very unexpected.
In the article that you read, I don't know. I'm kind of pissy, and anyone that gets in the way is going to get a little bit of it. So like whichever thing steps up. No offense to Italy, but the thing that you read, what did it talk about in regards to his first book? Did it say anything about his first book?
Which was the first one?
The first one is called, I always forget what it is because I only know it through what is in here. And that is not what I want to call it, but crap, I can't remember now. The first book that he wrote was a series of stories, and it's a huge like bestseller, and it might be The Velocity of Things. No, History Argentina, that's what it was.
Okay.
I believe that was the first book, and that one became like a bestseller in Argentina and is incredibly popular and incredibly well loved, and is incredibly like still in print, still does very well for him, is very like his name, and then everything after that is sort of History Argentina. Everything after that, I believe, is a little bit more like a rebuttal to that, or a moving away from that type of writing and that type of thing. And I bring this up because in this section, so the section that we read for today, or that's being covered today, I forget where it started. Was it 281 or something like that? 281 through 354 is the last section in which the ex-writer is on the plane and is kind of going through his own career a little bit more than it has in the past, a little bit more specifically, and then ends with him saying like he knows how to proceed, he knows what to write now, he knows what he's going to do, and comes to like a conclusion about writing or about doing a thing. So that's where it's going to end in here. But the section that at the beginning, or on page 328, that's relevant to this is when it talks about his first novel. This is like he's talking about how when he's in airports or whatever, he never sees anyone reading his books. His books aren't available. Nobody's reading them. They're all impossible. The Impossible Story, the last book that he wrote, that like caused like a furor, which is related to the invented part causing the little problem on St. George's Day, in which the Spanish government gave it to Catalonia as a joke about how their country is a creation, and and in this case he uses Impossible Story as like the stand-in for that. As I got into the details of it within the remembered part, but I know that that's what it is. But he's talking about how people don't read that, and about how he only writes books that are like that exist to exemplify the style in which they're written, that they are just pure style, except for his first book. And only once in a great while could anyone in hospital waiting rooms or at airport gates be spotted still holding his debut, once a bestseller in his now non-existent country of origin, novel, national industry, an anomaly at the time that in turn turned him into an anomaly, his name like a disturbance to ignore in the literary system, because in its day, national industry upset people. It was inopportune and startling, contradicting too many good theories with its for many bad practices. And then he goes on to talk about like then his future books like are kind of a rebuttal of that. His second book, Sacred Memories, which seemed to have been written almost in opposition to national industry. So different and also so happily misunderstood, in delivering recitations of the lives of mad saints and of the secret twin of Jesus Christ, with background music performed by the pianist Glenn Gould, and yes, praise to the clouds of cocaine atop which he wrote it like one possessed. But he does have this great bit that I think is interesting, because I think it's the opposite of what happens with Faison in real life. But the character in the book says, national industry was irrefutable proof that book readers were ever more abundant than author readers. Enthusiasm, interest, and attention lasted and were valued only for a single title that everyone read, no matter who was responsible for it. And in general, there was no point in proceeding to read the writer's previous or subsequent books. He, on the other hand, belonged to what appeared to be a now extinct species of reader, and he'd always followed the trail of a life to the bottom and beginning and end of its work. So in here he's saying like nobody, people read the book, the popular book, the one that everyone's talking about, but not that author's other books or that author's other things are following their career. But I think in real life, Faison is much more read as like an author and not as the individual books, like the ones that are English maybe gives it a limited view because it's Kensington Garden, Bottom of the Sky, and then the trilogy. But it's not like people, like any one of those people are like, oh, that's the one Faison book. It's like they read everything, and everything is always connected. There is like to poke fun at my least favorite auteur, Wes Anderson. There's a Faisana world of Faison in which all these things interlink and connect, and pieces and characters come up in different spaces, and there's like a universe, a Faisoniverse, so to speak, filled with referential things and different, the same authors, the same touchstones over and over again, and the same sort of concerns. But it does kind of create one, like he talks a lot in this first part of the Remembered Part about what essentially is mantra and is that book. It's not referred to as such, but it is told as like the book that, and this was in the earlier volumes of the trilogy too, that he took Penelope's karma experience and wrote it into a book, and she was pissed that he had stolen like her experiences to try and write them. And that, I believe, is the basis for mantra, which will come out at some point in time. But I think that that's interesting. Like there's like when you're saying like it is easy, but I think it's I don't think his books, I don't think on a sentence level, I think on a sentence level they're tricky for some people because they're long, list filled, so on and so forth. But that's not necessarily the hardest thing. But I think the fact that you kind of get sucked into the whole whirlwind of references and of places and of stuff is the kind of a more complicated and more daunting aspect of being able to read him.
Yeah. You asked so there is, I think you did mention, but there is a long review or article by Rodrigo Bastidas on the Historia Argentina. And the article that I read, the Master of Ceremonies, Maria Jose, the writer, excuse me, mentioned, so in the article I read, says that what Rodrigo Bastidas says is that Historia Argentina definitively makes history by refracting the possibilities of the world and of literature. And I mean, just the quote, like just the sentiments from this paragraph I'm going to read. So there's one article that examines 3 Faison novels, and that writer confesses that for him, Faison set the standard for what it was to be an intellectual or good reader. The omnivorous zeal, the reading it all. For Ramiro Sanchez, the Velocidad de las Cosas articulates a new narrative form, and then Historia Argentina definitively makes history by refracting. And then for all of them, and for the author of the article I wrote, Faison's writing isn't just impressive, it's indispensable. His books are among the ones that you remember the exact moment when you read them for the first time, and that soar over your life like a melody that never entirely leaves you. And I mean, even for that, I think it's funny that you mentioned the Glenn Gould thing, because I'm editing, fast tracking a Norwegian book, The Red Handler, for Open Letter, and one of the chapters, the Red Handler, the private investigator, arrests a guy who kills his wife, and there's like weird misunderstandings because the guy has earbuds in the whole time and he's listening to Glenn Gould's variations, and the Red Handler is obsessed with it and like loves listens to both versions. And yeah, so it's even that to me, it's like, connections. Connections and synapses.
Yeah. The so the ding ding.
Bing bong.
The part of the 3 people that I think I'll just read part of Will's one that fits in, because I don't really want to do the French one necessarily, but Will's has a couple of things that are worth mentioning, and then there's a few bits of this book that I just want to share, and I'll just kind of like read parts of or reference to you so that you because you haven't read it, but see if you what you think. But with his, Will goes through the whole thing of like, it's hard to choose anything. This is difficult, blah, 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 like exactly what I said. And then in the end, I chose a sentence from Remembered Part, the 3rd volume in Faison's Parts triptych. it wasn't included in the original edition, which is one of the things I wanted to point out, is that like with the other two books, but this one and more so than the other two, there was like an abundance of added material. Like all three of them, there were like things that he added and sections he added and bits that he added and added and added. But I
And
feel
these
like
are things that Rodrigo added.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That Rodrigo added over and over and over again. And it says, so it wasn't included in the original edition of La Parte Recordada, but was one of the many inserts that Frazan added during the process of translation. It appears in a series of sentences and paragraphs that describe a book the protagonist imagines writing, a book that is also, in a way, the book we are reading, and also in still another way, all books. I'm not going to read the Spanish version, and I don't know if it might be in this section, in fact, but I'm not entirely sure. But the sentence as he has it is, a book that would commit the perfect and pardonable crime and sin, proving irrefutably that lives have a logic and an order that exists, that lives are really novels or books of stories, that they are born and die, yes, but between one point and the other, they begin and end multiple times, and sometimes they close off their parts and doors by leaving them open. That looking back, they discover that secret thread of fate, correcting and redacting all sequence, A and then B and then C, in a transcendent consequence, A and thus B and thus C, and thereby giving meaning to the past. So he talks a little bit about the faithfulness of like where the beginning could have been a book that would commit, or like whatever, it goes through that. But then the thing that's interesting is that it is this part. So the sentence has a typical Frazanian structure, the list, and features some of his characteristic orthographical tendencies, the liberal use of semicolons and parentheses. It has a primary extended metaphor, lives as novels or books of stories, and a secondary implied metaphor, lives, novels or books of stories, as structures, parts, and doors that are closed off by being left open. And then he goes on to say that that's basically the whole protagonist bit in this book. There's the paradox at the heart of the whole triptych. It's no coincidence that the triptych's protagonist writes a book called The Impossible Story. What he's hoping to do to prove that lives have a logic and an order that exists is impossible, as the sentence's final turn so exquisitely demonstrates. Any logic and order that lives have is constructed, a fiction that memory creates post facto, looking back and discovering that secret thread of fate, correcting and redacting all sequence into transcendent consequence. So it's pretty interesting. I like that how Will chose this particular sentence, and it does really fit into this section. The thing that like specifically that it fits into, and this is where I thought maybe it's in this, maybe it's even in this page. It is. So it's right next to the part that I was going to quote. The part that I was going to quote is in this list of like the book. He's talking or thinking to himself about a book that would contain thousands of pages whose theme and plot would be the invocation of that same phantasmagoric book. And then he says, a book about the impossibility of writing that nevertheless couldn't stop being written. A book that would be the book with the most writing on the subject of not being able to write. A book that in practice would contain its theory and whose plot would reside in its style. A book that would say everything anyone else might say about it later about itself first. And that same thing, and then that sentence that he just quotes is right here. It's the next one. And it ties into that same idea of like trying to include everything. Like the book tries to include everything and tries to include the world, and that is what makes it complicated. And the only way that it can include the world through like a Gödelian incompleteness theorem is to include the criticism of itself and the non-writing of itself. Like there's a whole great bit in this section too about how it's impossible to talk about things that are forgettable because you have to forget them first. You can't say something's unforgettable until you try and forget it. And trying to forget something is way harder than remembering things, because you can remember things, but you can't remember forgetting them, so to speak. But there's some great sections in here. This one has a lot to do with like the fact that he doesn't have kids, he doesn't get married. Ella is never the woman that he never marries. There's like a good suicide part, more or less, which I'm down for. There's a lot of fun stuff in here. But some of the funnier bits, just to share this with anyone who's like listening along and just wants some motivation to like go into the book, even though, I mean, I don't know why you'd be listening to episode 6 and not having read the book or still needing to be sold on it.
People make mistakes.
What's that?
People make mistakes. The podcast app sometimes just loops around and starts playing the next thing as it will.
Sometimes, I mean, I think people just want to hear the sound of our voices and our jokes. They're probably disappointed that Brian's not here.
I know
But
this
there's
is going to have 0 downloads. Sorry, guys.
zero people are watching, so don't worry. The funny part, I think this part's funny, where he talks about the phrase expression was still "that man is an open book" and not yet "that man is a turned on tablet," which I think is pretty funny in his like rant against like electronic reading. And also
I
talks
like
about
this. I like that. I sometimes feel like the Kindle screen where it's like swipe to unlock. You're like, you're there. There's, you're just
whatever. So on blogs and in tweets, they all suffered from Tourette's syndrome, and they all screamed in all caps, riddled with orthographical errors. And they opined out everything they either knew or understood. And they condemned each other to hell as if they were diabolical, all-powerful emperors. And this is my favorite line. And they talk shit and were shit talked and talk shit about being shit talked, which is great. And then it's talking about people on Twitter. And wasn't it a little odd that people, given the opportunity to be other people online, always opted to be worse people than they already were? Just fun. And also, yeah. I'm watching too much Succession, because those people are the worst people ever. And every episode is just more proof that like if people in business act like this, they're all fucking morons. Like here, I'll make fun of Italy. I'll make fun of businessmen. Like they're all fucking morons saying nonsensical shit just because their egos and their dicks need to be stroked. And that is what that whole show is, just a condemnation of this entire class of CEO morons. And that is my 2 cents. Come at me on Twitter. I'll be a worse person than I am here. I'm already a pretty bad person. So
you're the most insufferable. You're the most insufferable.
The most insufferable. There's another where'd it go? Where did it all go? Shoot. Sorry. I had this all set aside, but then yeah, here's the thing about forgetting. And then she proceeded to expound on the paradox that for something to be truly unforgettable first, you had to try and forget it. And that it was much harder to forget than to remember. And then there's this part that I really love that is a reference to the types of readers there are. And so he's like, so not like he's talking about the positions that could be applied to attitudes for a hypothetical division between types of readers, not like the one Nabokov came up with in his day, running the gamut from the banality of book club members who needed to identify with the hero or heroine to readers who focus on the socioeconomic angle and prefer things like action and dialogue, to the nobility of readers who had to have memory and a dictionary and, quote, some artistic sense, but something more automatic, quote, the ones who needed to have everything explained to them and the ones who preferred not to know anything before it happened. I think that's a pretty good division between people. It reminds me of like the ongoing jokes about like when you start watching a movie with someone, they're like, what's going on? And you're like, the whole purpose is for that to be explained. Like that is the core concept of narrative. Like,
yep.
And then I do know some people who are like, will only watch things if they've already read all the spoilers and have to know everything that's going to happen ahead of time. I think that's like near verifiably insane to me, but like, so be it. People have their own thing. There's also the bit that does sort of tie this all together is that he references the story that he is told that Hitchcock, I think it was Hitchcock, woke up in the middle of the night with like this great idea for, here it is. Hitchcock woke up in the middle of the night in the dark, convinced that he'd come up with the best possible idea for a movie, the best story ever told and ready to be filmed. And then Hitchcock quickly wrote it down in a notebook and went back to sleep. And the next morning, expectant, he read what he had written there, and all it said was boy meets girl. And then he thought that, yes, boy meets girl was the best possible story to tell. He remembered a girl, and then he goes on to his own thing. But for the author in this book, the non-author, the ex-writer, whatever, there's the moment towards the end here, the sort of crescendo of this section that we've been building through all of his like hatreds, all of the other things he despises about culture, about the fact that he can't write, about the success of Penelope's books, that he's done with all of this, that, he's no longer a writer, everything was like failed, so on and so forth. And then you finally get to this part on 349, and then something clicks. And he clicks one of those pens that they give you on airplanes, and he writes something down on the in-flight safety instructions. And it's the first thing he's written in so long, and the first thing he's thought to put in writing. It's the first thing he remembers having put in writing, and who knows how long. And what he writes is man meets boy, him as in playing him suddenly decisive and definitive and capitalized. And that then goes to the last part where he says, asking him if now he knows how to proceed. He's talking about the pilot's asking a question for everyone. And he's like, I think it's just for me. He's asking me if now he knows how to proceed, how to go about starting to write again, how to go on once everything that has to happen has happened and make it to the end. The end being, he remembers now, all that's left to come to pass, the last thing to become present and future. And he answers the pilot and answers himself that yes, that he does, that he knows that now, he knows that and much, much more. And then he says, much, much more in a moment, which is one of the running gags throughout here is like, they keep saying like, oh, the impossible story causes fear, more on that in a moment, and goes on and on and on. So for this section, that part that Will talked about is really like the core of this whole 354 page like diatribe of sorts. Yeah. That's both like life and history and trying to make sense of the life and trying to make sense of writing, trying to write to make sense of the life, to try and make sense of everything. And it ends up finally getting to the point where he feels, I guess, that he can write again and that he has something to do. And that will like lead into part 2, which will be starting next week up to page 422. And part 2 is called The Reconstruction of the Fragments, the Eternity of Instants, the Marvel of Moments, and everything that came before that at the same time is only remembered now. So get ready. We're moving on to a new part with a whole new set of epigraphs and a different sort of structure in terms of how it's laid out or designed. And we're off into a new world, which will probably be the same world, told again, retold, reconstituted, refragmented, and an attempt to make sense out of all of this. So yeah. Thanks for bearing with us on the short one. Do you have any comments on any of that?
Do we know, or do you know, does Rodrigo keep lists of things he wants to mention in his books?
I don't think so, but I don't know. The one of the French person mentioned in the sentence that she chose, every single book and every single, and I think Will mentions this too, but every single book, every single section, every single time references Kurt Vonnegut, references Melville, references Nabokov, references Pink Floyd, references the Beatles. Like there's the same core bits that are always part and parcel of this. I also think it's interesting that this book and this section is set up where the ex-writer, the protagonist, is incapable of reading Nabokov's last book, or like not the last one, but the big Ardor, the one book that he hasn't read, and can't finish it, and talking about not being able to write and not being able to read this one book. So it's the two things that are being blocked. And for an earlier, in reference to an earlier point, the ex-writer refers to himself as someone who reads to write, that writes to read, that it's all about reading, not about the process of writing, not about the process of being on Twitter and being a writer, but to be reading. So I think that those things all tie together, and there's a lot more that we can kind of suss out with more time and more bits to this book. So tune in next week for the next section. We'll probably from here on out be on a weekly schedule without any problems. We'll be through 422 up to 422 next week. And until then, you can buy the books through Open Letter. The triptych's available for $40. No code needed. It's just available on the website. All of our other books are available there too. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this. Subscribe to the YouTube station. Send in comments. Send in questions. Tweet at the 2-Month Review Twitter if you want, and we'll bring those questions on air. And I'm going to make a startling admission to you right now, is that I just had a kombucha and I actually liked it.
What?